These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down.
Welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, Fanon and the Decolonial Imperative, Part 2, with the Kenyan Organic Intellectuals Network. Africa World Now Project is next. This cannot be repeated enough, as the dialectical relationship between anti-colonial praxis and the colonial logic of capital becomes ever more fascistic. We must be ever more clear on how violence is necessary to distort and make imperceptible the possibilities of a future. Simply put, the ever more overt application of violence as a means to maintain oppressive structures that guide the formation of consciousness, the more it arrests our ability to engage with the beyond struggle, beyond the now moment. The vast majority of us are caught within the cyclical patterns of manufactured realities of the capitalist imagination. Capital needs the literal lifeblood of those who are constituent parts of these manufactured realities, realities captured in incorrect notions of the inevitability of conflict, induced resource scarcity, the logic of private property, aggressive individualism, and the insolvability of the climate crisis. We are expected to spend majority of our time and energy surviving the daily crucible designed by capital. Okay, I can go on, but let's not get lost in the rhetoric. And now that you're probably equally lost in this long opening thought, we should at this point circle back to what I suggest cannot be repeated enough. And that is, colonial violence and colonial discourse are at the heart of Western modernity. They are constituent features of Western European modern ontology, knowledge production and distribution, and socio-political thought and economic practice codified in the 14th century. The use of ontology is another way of saying the study of the reality of being. In simpler terms, what makes a thing a thing. It is clear, or at least it should be, who the monsters are. So it is not necessarily novel in itself, but it still bears repeating. To add more clarity, adding more perspective, hoping to make more sense, or possibly confuse you even more. What I'm suggesting here is that we are living in the 21st century with 14th century conceptualizations of reality produced from the subsequent violence inherent in the contradictions built over centuries through capitalist logic, all interdependent on supremacist notions of a constructed whiteness, a world where false notions of reality are attached to color and class. This violence we are facing is what Fanon was unpacking. Structures of violence is what Fanon was intent to deconstruct, and one of his important contributions to a decolonial imperative. Therefore, it is here, within the material and non-material parameters of violence, that we can explore and examine Fanon's corpus to construct frameworks of analysis. Though we should never neatly apply nor seek to use linear logic without taking into consideration the historical evolution in the material and non-material conditions over time and space, Fanon's decolonial imperative stands as an important point of entry to understanding the current historical moment. Colonialism inherently gives colonized intellectuals an intellectual inferiority complex. In order to initiate the processes of revolutionary decolonization, the anti-colonial on the path to becoming post-colonial intellectuals must radically rupture their relationship with their neo-colonial miseducation and practice critical conceptual generation, putting forward dialectical theory and praxis particular to and in the best interest of their specific historical struggle against colonialism, capitalism, and racism, among other postmodern socio-political issues and ills. In a word, colonized intellectuals must decolonize their minds, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o puts it, and become revolutionary intellectual activists. Nigel Gibson offers more insight. The revolutionary intellectual who explicitly attempts to develop the often conflictual relationship between mental and manual labor, therefore is grounded in two interdependent, though different types of knowledge. First, the explication of subjugated knowledge and knowledge born of resistance in their myriad and not simply practical forms. And two, what Fanon meant by working out new concepts, namely the history of the idea of freedom. These knowledges are connected. Revolutionary thought is also a conceptualization of the historical memory of struggle. In challenging the underdeveloped and Manichaean ways of thinking produced by colonial rule, the Fanonian intellectual activists must also bear in mind what Amilcar Cabral contended. Quote, a people who free themselves from foreign domination will not be free culturally unless, without underestimating the importance of positive contribution from the oppressor's culture and other cultures, they return to the upwards path of their own culture. It is from the point of view of Fanon's critical theoretical framework, Marxist thought can be effectively used toward anti-colonial ends and, more importantly, in the processes of revolutionary decolonization. All with the understanding that we should not forget that, quote, Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time we have to do with the colonial problem. Fanon writes, when I search for, quote, man in the technique and style of Europe, I see only a succession of negations of man and an avalanche of murders. The human condition plans for mankind and the collaboration between men in those tasks which increase the sum total of humanity are new problems, which demand true inventions. For Fanon, the, quote, new problems are precisely the ones that the racial and colonial proletariat, as well as the racial colonial peasantry, have long been struggling against. Racism and colonialism, and the nexus and cross-currents of capitalism and colonialism and racism. Fanon asserted that we, that is the wretched of the earth's revolutionary intellectual organizers and activists, must, quote, combine our muscles and our brains in a new direction. And the, quote, new direction that he had in mind was one that simultaneously built on and went well beyond Marxist analysis of the vicissitudes and vampiric nature of capitalism. In essence, we must simultaneously think beyond struggle while creating a practice beyond the now moment. Today, we explore Fanon's decolonial imperative, intentionally exploring the impact of Fanonian thought on struggles today. The conversation you will hear next is rooted in the ideas and thought of Frantz Fanon and his relationship to current individual and collective work of those engaged in struggle in Kenya to bring about a new society. Ultimately, we are interested in how Fanon is part of a tradition of African revolutionary thought and practice which informs us collectively. The questions that guided our conversation that helped us center our ideas were: 1. What strands of Fanon's thought are important to help us frame and understand the current global crisis brought on by capitalist logic? And 2. How does Fanon inform our task in this moment? Fanon wrote, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. Are we on the edge of betraying our mission? What can we do to fulfill it? What ideas, concepts that Fanon offers are useful to us in this current moment? How do we see beyond struggle? What is the vision of a new society? Joining us was Nicholas Mwangi, a writer, organizer, and member of the Mkombozi Library in Kenya. He contributes regularly to People's Dispatch. Nicholas has co-edited Breaking the Silence on NGOs in Africa, and Kenyan organic intellectuals reflect on the legacy of P.O. Gama Pinto. He is currently working on a forthcoming book titled The Crises of Capitalism in Africa with the Organic Intellectuals Network in Kenya. Waringa Wahome is an organizer, political theorist, lawyer, and also coordinator of the Legal Empowerment Hub at Mathare Social Justice Center, as well as member of the Kenyan Organic Intellectuals Network. Please forgive the quality of audio in certain parts of our conversation. The ideas and voices are essential and vital, so we chose to share with you in its current form. One of our comrades was outside of Nairobi at the time of recording. Our show was produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all people. Listen intently, think critically, act accordingly. Thank you for joining us today. Rowinga, could you just introduce yourself, what formations that you are a part of, and also talk a little bit about your politicization? What is it that kind of sparked your political consciousness and the work that you're engaged in at this particular point?
Thank you very much for hosting me again on this platform. My name is Warenga Wahome. I am a lawyer in practice. But also a social justice defender. I think I come from Madari Social Justice Center, and at Madari Social Justice Center, I host a unit called the Legal Empowerment Hub. The Legal Empowerment Hub is a unit. It's a unit of Madari Social Justice Center that comes together through Madari Social Justice Center as an organization and my personal law firm, which is Warenga Home Company Advocate, to form a Legal Empowerment Hub that can be used, that can be able to change the conception of the law, and at least introduce a social justice jurisprudence or an alternative jurisprudence from the criminalization of poverty that we have experienced, from the normal criminal justice systems, from law structures not working for the disenfranchised of our society. And I think the Legal Empowerment Hub seeks to use law as a tool for advancing social justice work and for building social justice movements. So movements look at how they can use the law to advance and build community agencies within themselves. Say, for example, the Domestic Workers Network, which can be able to use the law as a tool to advance, the struggles of domestic workers. Our Waste Speakers Network, Ecological Justice also can use the law as a tool to advance, the struggles of the environment and how we can build an eco-socialist society. And of course, we have a campaign against extrajudicial killings, which challenges police brutality. We have the housing question, and how land networks can use the law also to advance the critical question of land, of housing. And I think that's as much as I can use to introduce my organization. As far as what politicized me as an individual, I think I don't really have a story of how I was politicized. I came into politics because, I don't know, maybe because lawyers find their way into politics somehow. But I was captured by the salvation of Fanon, because now I would have found myself within bourgeois politics. But somehow I found myself in the social justice discussions, in the socialist discussions, and I think they continue to inspire me and inspire my development intellectually, organizationally, and I think also personally. And I think as I have continued to delve in the studies of building an alternative socialist society, and thinking about Pan-African ideas to liberate myself as an individual, my people, and my Africa. I think I continue to be inspired by that line of politics that holds that we can build a society where we're all equal as far as poverty does not determine whether or not you will access quality healthcare, quality education, whether or not you will eat food, or whether or not you will die from a treatable disease. I think we all envision a society where we can live dignified lifestyles. And I think that continues to inspire my journey, and that continues to at least align with the correct line of politics.
Thank you for that. And of course, I'll pull Nicholas into kind of like the conversation. But, of course, we're talking about Frantz Fanon and particularly the ideas, the frameworks and concepts that Frantz Fanon was thinking or dealing with in the context of a colonial and also the colonized and the colonizer. There's a particularity or a specificity or specific ideas that Fanon is dealing with: decolonization, violence, this notion of a new society, land, the use of radio, the use of propaganda specifically by both colonized and the colonizer. So there's a number of particular thoughts and strands of frameworks that Fanon uses to understand or to provide some type of understanding of what colonization does at a very, very deep level. But he also has a very particular framework or idea of how the colonized should address those questions. He wrote a number of treatises, a number of books on this particular topic. So how does Fanon show up? What are some of the specific ideas that Fanon presents, and how does Fanon kind of inform the work that you're doing, Rowinga, in this particular moment?
I think critically is that I organize within an informal settlement, one of the largest informal settlements here in Nairobi, which is most populated by Fanon's favorite class, the Lumpens, where the Lumpenized societies has been so advanced recently. And I think if there is something critical that he speaks about that we live in the reality of in our society now, is how the psychology of oppression affects people. Psychologically, even in their capacity to fight, and to defend their dignity, or to even be able to conceptualize that they're living in a small bubble of capitalism. I think because most people in my Madara society have internalized violence. They have internalized the characteristics of the oppressed. They have made them, they have adopted that fatalism as a trait, in their everyday struggles. They have adopted horizontal violence among themselves, trying to defend basic dignities, but defending them in the wrong way. And I think the consciousness that Fanon introduces is, why have these people internalized poverty? Why have they internalized violence? Why have they internalized, living in undignified lifestyles? How have they internalized them and made them a reality? In fact, they get to a point where they say, this is how I was born. It is the writing of the Lord. Not realizing that poverty itself is a man-made creation. And I think the injunction that Fanon introduces through his consciousness is that there can always be a different form of violence other than horizontal violence, that people can use their violence not to each other, but against an oppressive state. They can use it at that time against colonialism, but at this time, people can organize and use this horizontal violence not towards each other, but against the neo-colonial state. And such kind of consciousness. And also the fact that we can change this despair that people have reached to, this state of despair. We can convert it through Fanonian consciousness, that it can become hope. We can convert the despair that people can every day live in crime, every day live in drugs, every day facing police brutality as if it's their daily norm. And we can convert this despair, we can convert this fatalism, we can convert this indecisiveness among, the lumpenized society of Madara, for example, is within also the social justice movement, which also organizes within these lumpenized societies of different parts of Nairobi. For example, we have Madara Social Justice Center, we have Kayole Community Justice Center, we have Dandora, Kizorai, and Monge also comes from Tanzania Community Justice Center. All these communities that have internalized horizontal violence, that have internalized, mode of oppression and become, adopted a fatalistic kind of tendencies. They can, I think Fanonian consciousness helps a lot in advancing change and also helping with organizing people around this question of violence. And I think as the conversation unfolds, we will look at, what this revolutionary violence looks like. And also when Fanon talks about a lumpenized society, what society we are describing and what futures we see within this lumpenized society and what kind of force it produces, specifically here in Kenya. How Magare, how other informal settlements, this lumpenized society, how are they well positioned in a manner that when it comes to capturing political power, or when it comes to now, advancing Fanonian thought on who constitutes the lumpen class. I think as we continue advancing in that discussion, we realize that it is this class of the lumpenized society that at this time in Kenya, I will hold, and in other parts of Africa, that has the biggest potent force of sparking even a working class consciousness, or even sparking a revolutionary consciousness among our people within our lifetime or within our time. Yeah.
Nicholas, you can jump in. There is, two follow-ups I would love to follow up, but if you want to jump in, you could just raise your hand and I just jump right on in because there's two follow-ups I would definitely want to talk about. Go ahead, Nicholas.
Or you wanted to go with the follow-up first, or?
Yeah. So, we're talking about, I like the position or the imposition, the lumpen, right? Fanon has a particular, and so does Cabral, right? And the role of the different classes in society in revolution, right? The lumpen, the bourgeoisie, there is a particular role that Fanon is looking at, because what we're talking about ultimately is how do we develop a consciousness, a revolutionary critical consciousness to change, not only recognize what's happening in society, but to change society. So there has to be a certain level of a vision that needs to be put forth, right? You have a vision from, the bottom, you have a vision from the middle, and of course we know the imperialists have a vision, right? So how do we understand, particularly because the communities that you're working in, and you use this very interesting term, you talked about Mathare as a society, and you talk about the social justice centers as the middle of like a society. Could you just unpack those or look at those particular classes from Fanon looking at it in a particular way, but in the work that you're doing as well? What is that society that is attempting to kind of be put forth?
I'm confirming whether it's for me or for Mwangi. But Mwangi is the most theoretical among us. So I don't know. But as far as the stratification of these classes, I think, or I hold the position that within the lumpen class, and also because Fanon, even if we unpack Fanon a little bit and we interact with Fanon, as a revolutionary at his time, as a human being, as a doctor of the mind, but also at that time within the Algerian War, when people are going through the most difficult times, when you read the rest of the earth and interact with some of the case studies that he was dealing with, there are some of the cases that we see now, but in a different fashion, because at that time it is out of colonial oppression. At this time it is out of colonial oppression. But at that time, when Fanon describes the lumpen proletariat, Fanon describes a lumpen proletariat of people who are completely jobless. They are like the rest of the earth. They are the people that the earth that are not considered human beings or worth of dignity to be called a human being. And of course, that stratification still exists in our society now, which is the lowest stratification within the lumpen class. And at the same time, even within this lumpenized society, and I think I will borrow from some of rising left thinkers of Africa, who are starting to look at this lumpen proletariat as a class of people who are not specifically the most downtrodden of the earth. It is looking at them as far as their relationship with capital and labor, and how consistent they are with their relationship with capital and labor. And of course, we will find that many young people who are coming from university studies, who are mainly in Africa, who do not secure jobs, so they do not form a stable relationship with capital and with labor. They do not secure any form of contractual employment or even uncontractual employment. They will qualify to be called skilled laborers, considering that they have degrees and whatnot, but they don't qualify as skilled laborers because there are no jobs. And Kenya or Africa, in some parts, are not industrialist countries, so they do not have places where they can offer employment. Other than now that we're seeing the brains of young people being used to, being extracted to go and serve the metropole. But essentially, there are no industries in Kenya or Africa. So these young people who are coming from employment do not then form a stable relationship with capital and labor. They again form a class where they survive on an everyday basis. They can survive from trickery. They can survive from just shady deals of selling clothes at higher prices so you can keep your extra. They survive in a way that naturally would be how the lumpenized society that Fanon used to describe survive now. So I think we must expand our scope of how we look at the lumpen proletariat. Because I think it's in Brazil where the leader of the MST, his name I will not even attempt to pronounce, but the leader of MST was called to the parliament of Brazil, and he called the parliamentarians because he was asking, how can you form a movement so big that people are volunteering on their own to work for MST, to wake up in the morning and put flags in the market of MST? And he called the parliamentarians, called them lumpen bourgeoisie. And I think it's the first time I had interacted with the concept of the lumpen bourgeoisie. But you see, we have a lumpen bourgeoisie, which means we also have a lumpen proletariat. So when we talk about a lumpen proletariat, we're talking about a lumpenized society, which of course still experiences these levels of violence, still lives within this wretched section of the earth, because they also come from where from, but they are also the bulwark of the labor within the industrial space in Kenya, even if it is a privatized industrial space. They're the ones who clean, they're the ones who make the machinery, they're the ones who do a lot of that work, which they consider skilled, but they have gained skill out of expertise. It is the domestic workers. It is who have formed a huge bulwark of our society. They are working people. It's just that the law does not specifically recognize them as working people. It is true they live in a lumpenized society, but they are lumpen workers, so they're lumpen, as a class of lumpen projects, these domestic workers, it is waste pickers who every day, for as long as there is a system of production, of course, there is a system of waste. So it is these waste pickers, they are waste workers. In China, I think they call them waste workers as well, because they are working people. So the consciousness of these people as workers, say for example, people who work in the matatu industry, the transport industry in Kenya, they are a working force, but people do not recognize them as workers because their work does not pay like normal taxation rates in the country. But in actual sense, they are workers. So a consciousness of these transport workers, a consciousness of these speakers, a consciousness of these domestic workers in itself has the capacity to spark a working class consciousness. For now, these people who are classified as the working class and the proletariat of our society, because organizing the proletariat of our society, right now they're living in comfortable way. They are feeling very comfortable. They are comfortable in their oppression, they're comfortable in their struggles, they're comfortable in their dignity. Therefore, sparking their consciousness would have to come from somewhere. And right now, I think our position is that the people that have the capacity, the revolutionary potence to spark working class consciousness are the people that come from this organized society. So they are the lumpen proletariat. I don't know whether I have addressed the question very well.
No, thank you for that. I mean, go ahead, Nicholas, please.
Yeah.
I'll build up where Comrade Warenga has already set the pace. And I think generally what Fanon teaches us is that to be human is to be in struggle, is to fight and to change material reality. The question we are trying to confront and the key thing at the center of today's world and in Africa is the economic crisis we are facing. And that's why Comrade Warenga has rightly put the working class at the center of it, trying to fulfill their needs and to live a dignified life from Madare and to every part of the world. But the global crisis, which is capitalism in its neoliberal phase, as we know it here at this point in time, has exhausted even the illusion of democracy that it keeps preaching everywhere. The justice, not only from what is happening in the Sahel, in Africa, and I think which I'd mentioned in the other part of the podcast, which I find a lot of inspiration from it. But from the Sahel and to the genocide in Gaza, we are watching the complete inability of the capitalist system to manage life, to provide a dignified life for the working people. It has no solution for a dignified life. It has no solution for the ecological collapse that we see, for the growing inequality, for the alienation and despair that the working people face daily. And Fanon was clear that the reaction for this, because the capitalist system reinforces and divides, dehumanizes, and justifies violence through an imposed logic to the people. And Warenga had mentioned horizontal violence. And so today, the coloniality of power is globalized. And so it's important because it no longer wears the uniform of the European colonizers, we know it. But the logic remains the same, nevertheless. It is extraction, exploitation, and exclusion. Even worse for the countries in the periphery, like Kenya and the rest of Africa and the global south, of how that surplus value, of how that labor is extracted to sustain the profits, to sustain the economy in the north. It's an important to see as a continuation, the anti-colonial struggle, being it in the neoliberal phase. And it's important when we read The Wretched of the Earth, we also Fanon also talks of imperialism, and he says that it never completely lives. There's a quote, if I can paraphrase, that imperialism leaves behind germs of rot, which must clinically detect and remove from our land, but from our minds as well. So that rot, it is internalized domination, internalized colonialism. It is the comprada leadership, that the elite leadership that we have, the elite betrayal of the fruit of independence that happened. And again, Fanon had mentioned and analyzed of how that elite class that emerged just after independence was just an intermediary between Africa and imperialism, not to provide any systemic change, but to continue that long route of extraction. So today, that crisis of capitalism is also a crisis of legitimacy, because we see that crisis in Haiti. We see that crisis in Sudan. We see that crisis in Kenya. We had our protests last year. That's a burst of that crisis. So it's a changing world, but how has it lost legitimacy, and how does it inform how we organize and we struggle? One, capitalism has proved to be a system with no future to talk about. You ask the question, what future are we talking about? What vision are we providing for our people? And it's important because you have to create a worldview of where you are going, because that worldview gives hope. And hope is an important part of the struggle. So, and in that sense, the system has lost legitimacy. We know how it reinforces the hegemony of how it sustains itself, because you have been told numerous times, if you're looking for a solution, just look for it within the current capitalist system. And other systems will be cited as an example of systems that were tried and failed. And so there has been a sense of hopelessness among the people that perhaps these systems look natural. That is a natural system. You found it, exist in it. And if you want change, just try to find change within it. So we have to continue to struggle and organize that alternative, but most importantly, paint a picture of what kind of society we want to build. So this understanding, it helps us to frame the crisis, not as an unfortunate economic situation, but as the product of a global system built on theft, domination, and colonialism. So Fanon concept on revolutionary violence is not simply about bloodshed, and this has been misconstrued and been misled by liberal scholars who have wanted to convince us of Fanon being mesmerized with violence. It's untrue. So its concept, we can relate that revolutionary violence with also the rapture that we've seen across the world, that we see across the Sahel, that has led to a resurgence of the Pan-African spirit, where Pan-African revolutionaries like Kwame Nkrumah, Amilcar Cabral, Samora Machel are now in the mainstream talk. People are now mentioning like it was in the 60s. That's an important part of the raising of the consciousness. And so that those raptures in form of popular are also important, not without contradictions, not without mistakes, but it's important when we speak that we want to change a society, that we want to create a good society, that we also think of political power. And we are seeing a situation where political power has been captured. As our organizing is a struggle also to capture that political power and change the life of the working class. So that is key, and it informs the task before us. It has been done. We have seen moments historically to know that revolutionary change that changes society is very possible.
Thank you for that. Did you want to please comment, Waringa?
Once has introduced, which is a very profound scientific analysis of capitalism and the crisis of capitalism, and of course introducing a concept of what society we want to be. I think for sure I appreciate that he has sparked the discussion of the resurgence of Pan-Africanism, also that, which is a concept also which Fanon had spoken about, which I think I can only echo what Comrade Bondi has said, that this resurgence of Pan-Africanism and the show of what revolutionary violence or revolutionary sort of war can look like in this 21st century and in our societies now. And it can also help us to integrate the question, why Africa, for example, which has had what he has described as raptures, why Africa, which has had so many raptures over the past couple of years, I think a decade long, of serious long-running protests, and not just in Africa, but also in many parts of the world, where people have had serious protests, but none of those protests have led us to a revolutionary struggle, which is something also that we can use such Fanon ideas and ideas such as those of Cabral to integrate why such things and why these protests do not lead to a revolutionary struggle. And I think some of the errors that we make is that we do not embed the struggle in our working class sort of consciousness. And a lot of non-working class ideas arise even from NGO spaces, which I think in Kenya specifically, the social justice movement was very critical in criticizing this NGO sort of mentality that is coming up in left spaces or in social justice organizing spaces or social movements where people want to defend their dignity. NGOs come up and eat them up like I'm looking for that animal that eats things up when we don't see them, but it's just eating it up like a rat at night. These NGOs, how the infestation is affecting the development of these movements and, development of agents, of people's agency to, advance critical questions that are, existing in our societies. And also the fact that I think Comrade Mwangi has brought out as asking that what does this political leadership look like, or what does this alternative economic society look like, or political economic society look like, that we are, looking to develop and advance. But I think that's also another reason why we can critically look at why these ruptures and these protests that have been going on for a decade. People are also talking about Pan-Africanism, but it is not quite clear which sort of Pan-Africanism that people are talking about. And I think it is also quite critical that, when we talk about capturing political power, we must critically look at, what role revolutionary violence can play, consolidating political power, what role our own social movements can play in consolidating political power, all the political parties that we are affiliated with and capturing this power, and, helping in the consolidation of the power as well through the movements and through, other social forces that exist in our society. But I think I just wanted to enrich more on this content.
No, thank you for that. And just to kind of drill down just a little bit more, when we talk about extraction and we talk about the position of the different classes in a neocolonial context of Kenya, what does extraction look like in Mathare and Kibera, in these particular communities that you all are working in? What does extraction look like? Oh, we'll start with, Moringa, if you can start, and then we'll go to Nicholas.
I think I can start because we lived through what extraction looks like last year.
Yeah.
When, first of all, looking at Mathare as a society, which is a low-benign society, it's an informal settlement where public goods such as healthcare and education are a rare thing to find. Perhaps you find one public school, serving a huge population of people. So you can imagine first that the level of education is also not the best in this society. But imagine living in that kind of undignified condition, and then comes huge floods, a natural crisis which can be debatable whether it was natural or not, but a natural crisis that comes and takes away your home, your lives, your property, everything you knew to be home for many, many years. And a government, instead of protecting you, they say that the only means of protection they can offer is demolish more homes that are at the risk of, being flooded away by, the heavy rains. And they demolished homes for so many people. First, the people who are left without places to stay, people who are left without food, without dignity, without knowing what to do next. Then, as if that is not enough, we were just coming from a little feeling of people trying to recuperate. Comes the finance bill 2024, which is even more extractive because these are people who can barely afford their livelihoods, they can barely afford their food, they can barely afford dignity, they can barely afford healthcare. So to then increase that form of taxation and force them to work even more. Because it will, if you go to industrial area, for example, which is one of the industrial sites in Kenya, Nairobi, workers start there every day, and in the morning they say, today we are paying only 400 shillings. If you don't want to get paid 400 shillings, you go home. You won't be a worker for today. So you go back to Mathare, you probably have had your home already demolished. You probably have no sense of tomorrow. You have no sense of hope. And I appreciate mostly that Comrade Mwangi said that hope is very critical in our book. When you leave someone without hope and you keep extracting things from them, and they have to live through the life where they have to live through everyday exposure to police brutality, extrajudicial killings, every day living at the mercy of the crisis of capture. I think living in that kind of society and knowing that there is no sense of food sovereignty even in the peasant neighborhoods, I think I would describe that as extraction. And now kind of perspective, because it is extracting from somebody even your soul. Like the crisis as far as the society is already too harsh. So you've gone from extracting, with societal and economic expectations, now you're extracting somebody even their mental capacity. You're demanding so much mental strength just to survive a day, tomorrow. You've already taken everything away from somebody. People are killing themselves because they cannot figure out, they cannot see the end. Many people are reaching a point of despair. They don't have the ideological consciousness to see an end to this struggle. So naturally, many of our people are dying from mental health crisis, which is not actually a mental health crisis, a capitalist crisis. So yeah, I think that is extraction, but Comrade Mwangi can advance it more.
No, sure. And this extraction, of course, you can say is multi-dimensional. It happens in many. Not extraction, maybe in the form of oil and minerals. It's largely that happens in Africa. But what happens in informal settlements, which is Madare, Kibera. There's also Mukuru. There are other parts of informal settlements that provide labor for these industries. But the extraction is about their human life also. It's labor that they provide. It is land that they occupy and live. They are displaced, that they are attacked for living there, that they live in areas that don't have the basic necessities to provide a dignified life. But there's also extraction of votes from these areas when it comes to election time. That's the only time you'll see informal settlements like Madare gaining relevance in terms of a national discourse. It's when there's a election. There's also extraction of culture, and a lot of suffering that happens in informal settlement. But eventually what happens is that this is converted into value for someone else. So there's extraction in every way. If we mention labor the way we have mentioned, they are underpaid to work in the industry. They are unprotected. Yet they are very essential to the functioning of this capitalist economy, especially here in Nairobi. And Warenga knows this when you see in the morning a lot of people walking to work, not even using the buses to work. People walk to and go back home walking because they're underpaid and they cannot be able to afford paying transport. If you combine your paying transport and buying food and paying rent, that money is not enough. So this is cheap. And surplus labor, whose exploitation allows these industrialists in Nairobi and even landlords in informal Nairobi to accumulate without paying the true cost of labor. So that one we see. I mentioned that the land occupied by slum dwellers, with time, these informal settlements are becoming they have value in terms of real estate, and so informally settled, but now it's been formally claimed by elites, by business people, and that's why there are many attempts of land grabbing and displacement in many areas that are happening. So eviction sometimes becomes very violent. There is attempts to upgrade these projects, and some are very controversial. We have something like affordable housing, literally displacing many of those, and what they are building is not enough to accommodate what's happening. So yeah, there's that extraction. Maybe finally, because poverty is violent, there's a lot of militarization that happens in informal settlement. There are police patrols, too many, brutality. There are enforced disappearance. Actually, that's what Madare social justice was founded in, and the largest social justice movement to counter and to protest the enforced disappearances that were happening. So these are happening in informal settlements. They're not happening everywhere. Also, criminalization of organizing, that resistance, that counter, it does not happen easy. That struggle does not happen easy because there's a confrontation with systemic violence. And Fanon teaches us that violence of the system always returns. And so the state will always is unable under this system to solve the crisis of poverty. The colonial tactics that were used will continue, and that is repressing and suppressing the poor informal settlements, majorly by extraction of their labor, but among other things that I've mentioned. Yeah.
I wanted to, kind of, I guess, put two concepts or kind of deal with two particular areas or two strands of thoughts, particularly the role of African intellectuals. Of course, you all are part of a network of organic intellectuals who are a range of organizers, activists, students, community members and, informal settlements who have come together to develop a level of political consciousness, right? A level of political education at the grassroots level, and then attempt to raise the consciousness of the masses. So the role of the African intellectual, not necessarily, I guess, the contestation between the university or professional, but also the importance of the intellectual from the community, the intellectual, disrupt that intellectual context. And I'm also interested in what are some ways that role of the organic intellectual be globalized. I guess is kind of think through some of the structures. I know we're doing it right now in the context of multimedia space. Of course, we're having a conversation on two sides of the world. But what are some ways, or what are some things that we can do to globalize or create a global commons of resistance where we're sharing, we're in this process of constantly sharing ideas in the context of what we're fighting in, right? At the same time, to develop a stronger unity where Pan-Africanism is the forethought in every organizer's mind in the African world. Again, Comrade Mwangi knows I give these very, complex questions that I'm trying to solve the issues of the world in this. I'm just joking, but anywhere in that, please jump in, and we'll start with Comrade Mwangi if you want to start, and then Comrade Waringa, you can chime in as well.
Sure, yeah, indeed, they are complex. And yeah, because we are trying to figure out a long term
Yeah.
blueprint, but
Right.
there's no one blueprint. But yeah, indeed, there is a role for intellectuals to play a revolutionary role that intellectual should play. And for instance, when the Organic Intellectuals Network was founded, part of it was to encourage and to recognize that where a struggle is happening, there is knowledge production happening. And those people of those communities indeed are engaging and interacting with knowledge. They are producing knowledge that can be used, can be documented, can be used to find the solutions of what they're going through and what the world is going through, rather than the researchers coming and extracting the knowledge. Not a two-way. There's that appropriation of knowledge that also, if intellectuals do not immerse themselves in the struggle, are likely to do. But organic intellectuals have that role, a recognition that intellectuals just don't emerge from universities and colleges alone. They are formed in the soil of people's everyday struggles, and that they have a role to help their communities make a sense of their oppression and build strategies to end. For instance, some of the work the Organic Intellectuals Network has done, it has used one method majorly, and it's called reflection, where organizers within the network and the social movements at large in Kenya have been encouraged to read a book, reflect on that book, but now bring the lived experience of what people go through in the community. Match that lived experience with as a form of reflection, but also engage with another ideological material to enable you to find the root cause of the issues we are facing. And so you can use any other guide, Kwame Nkrumah, Milka Cabral, Patrice Lumumba, all these other theories if you wish so. But it's a reflection, and most importantly, to find the root cause of the issues that people are going through. Another role that the organic intellectuals or intellectuals play in this current is that they also provide a way of countering the hegemony against neoliberal reality, and that ideology that is presented as natural with no alternative to speak of. So it is important to engage in the battle of ideas, and intellectuals have the muscles to do that. But anybody else who find interest can contribute in the battle of ideas. It is not done only by intellectuals coming from institutions. They will help in countering the capitalist narrative, Eurocentrism, some of the theories that we have been fed in the development theory for those in the continent. The NGO discourse they will be able to interrogate it properly, and so able to find proper solution, break that monopoly of knowledge, and challenge states and donor narratives. And so this is very important especially for organizing a movement, because it equips our movements with the ideological clarity that we need and historical grounding of where we are coming from and where we are supposed to be heading in terms of that vision that we are creating. And so everybody plays an important role, be it you're a poet, student, workers, mothers, storytellers. They are bringing lived knowledge and political study into this conversation. And in another way, it bridges that intergenerational struggle between different generations, because that's how we have been doing. The kind of books we have been reading on Kenya have been written by people who are older than us, by people who participated in the struggle a long time ago, and we have been able to bridge and have a conversation that also informs the tactics and strategies the movements and the organizations are to use, which is very important to theorize on the tactics and the strategies of what used to work, what is not working. There's a changing world. How do you adapt and find new ways? It can only happen through an intergenerational exchange. And so further intellectuals can inform our political education that we carry, and we think it's very important for our movement and build that political consciousness in regard to political education that as intellectuals can play. And it's important because the political education turns anger into that vision that we are trying to achieve. It turned that history we have been grounded into a weapon that we can use not to make the mistakes that have been made, but to learn who's friend, who is our enemy in this struggle as a working class or working people in the struggle. And so be able to turn these isolated actions that happen around Kenya or even globally where struggles are into a strategy. Because while Fanon says rupture is important, but it is incomplete without it being organized. And so for us, we are trying to ensure that how do we make sure that the moments of rupture do not become spontaneous and become an end to themselves, but just the beginning into a long-term struggle for change. So it's very important, I think, that kind of role that intellectuals can play, in my perspective, but they must be grounded in their local struggles, but also be connected across a border.
No, thank you for that. And I often look at political education because Comrade Mwangi mentioned this earlier in our conversation that, there's instances where people utilize Fanon and other revolutionary praxis or thoughts as just kind of like rhetoric or rhetoric, it's rhetoric, right? It's just emptiness or meaningless jargon. I often say that political education is the process of studying into action. How do we study into action? It's not just to read for the sake of reading. It is a real material an intellectual process of understanding the words and ideas of one particular point in time where folk were on the move. The social motion of the masses was revolution or radical change. And how do those ideas, or how, as even Fanon talks about Marxism, stretching, Marx to the colonial question. And when we're talking about, the African world, including here in the United States, what we're talking about is a colonial question. And I don't think that should be lost on anyone's analysis as well. As we kind of, come to a pause again, I never like to say close. I think both of you kind of know that, at this particular time, there's a perspective, or there's a thought, some words that are attributed to Frantz Fanon, where he says Africa is shaped like a revolver. Congo is the trigger. This kind of gives a very clear understanding of the interconnectedness of not only the struggles on the ground, but also how imperialism and capital really, localizes its violence. But there is still this dominant idea. All of it is kind of connected to the dehumanization of African people. So with that being said, if you can share some of your perspectives, or how you're looking at some of the movements across the African continent, particularly when we think about the Burkina Faso. You mentioned, Haiti. Any reflections on how you see, or what is the conversation like amongst those who are engaged in struggle in your context, but also as you're communicating with other folk across the African continent? What are some of the perspectives, or how do you all see what's happening in the movements that are kind of burgeoning, but in particularly from that bigger context, like Burkina Faso, what's happening there? Any reflections as we kind of move to a pause in our conversation? Which, of course, this is one entry point into many things that I have a vision for us in collaboration with. But what are some perspectives of what's happening on the continent itself, particularly not the imperialist perspective? We're very, we're clear. Well, most people should be clear, but what are some of the movements? How are we looking at that, the resistance that's happening? And Comrade Waringa, you can start, please.
I think my opinion would be that if anyone in their country, in their locality, is struggling every day to defeat imperialism, and if there is any movement in whichever locality, whether in Kenya, whether in whichever part of Africa, whether in Asia, whether in America, in Europe, if there is anyone, wherever they are, who are struggling every day to defeat imperialism, that in itself is the duty of the revolutionary. It is the duty of every cadre in this struggle. It's the duty of anyone who calls themselves conscious of the crisis of capitalism, to defeat imperialism in all its effort. And I think in Kenya here, it is our duty to envision this new sense of Pan-Africanism. What does it look like? What kind of alternatives are we, political, economic alternatives are we looking for Africa and for Kenya and for our people? What does dignity look like? What does consolidating, for example, the social justice movement in Africa, from the ones that have been formed in Uganda, in, Shishibani, for example, in South Africa, all these movements that deal with social justice questions, what does unifying these movements look like? What does having a political position, a political roadmap, towards, socialist construction in Africa? What does that look like for our people? What role do our movements have in this construction? I think, again, even Freire expounds on when you were introducing on, what political education looks like. I think Freire enriches it to say that it is a theory of action, reflection, action. Is that every time there is any form of action, whether revolutionary or, within a reform line, there is a set of reflection on that action. Then people can form the next action based on that reflection of the previous action, so that people can correct errors and clarify errors and correct mistakes. And I think it is as long as people are engaging in active social practice, I think the revolutionary wheel is continually moving. As long as everyone is struggling to defeat US hegemony, I think the revolutionary wheel is forever rolling. Yeah, let me pass the microphone to.
Sure, Comrade Warenga, and any victory waged or won by any movement in this struggle in any part of the world is a victory for us all, and that's why internationalism is important for us. That's why it is important to connect all these struggles together to increase collaboration efforts among us, be it in political education, be it in organizing, discussing, analyzing where has the world reached, and in the context of Burkina Faso. Fanon was also writing during the time of Cold War. And interesting now in the 100 years that we are celebrating Fanon, we're also in the context of a changing world in terms of a multipolar world, and that's it's an important factor to look at when we're discussing not only Burkina Faso but also the Mali and Niger in the Sahel. These countries have now become or emerged as the epicenters of rupture against the post-independence neo-colonial order that we have been experiencing for a while now. So popular uprising and the military takeovers in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, I think for me represents more than just merely episodic kind of coups as framed by Western and capitalist narratives. Rather, these are expressions of a deeper crisis that we have just been discussing since we start, because we are seeing these governments expelling the French troops, shutting down the French media, and trying to pivot away from the France currency and its neo-colonial control, and in some cases try to open up in working with other countries that they think are on their interests or favor their issues. So it is very significant when you speak of self-determination as an idea, because Pan-Africanism is no longer a slogan of the past. We just don't mention it in vain. We see it as a project, as this continuous project that has had its moment of pause, its moment of so-called defeat, its moment where it has been misrepresented, but it's becoming an organizing principle again, and that is very important for us in the continent and everybody in the world, because we are witnessing that rotting corpse of colonialism and neo-colonialism, which is not yet buried, but it's decaying, and we can see it even with this viciousness. And so that Sahel break is not yet a revolution, but it's a break that we appreciate in the continent, because it is a refusal, it's a crack in the system, and any crack globally in the system, it's a win for the working people, for the working class, for those who have been dismissed by systems of power. So, and these sentiments, this attitude is fueled by mass disillusionment across the entire Africa. It's not just what is happening in Sahel. And I think we shall continue to see more ruptures in the coming years. We cannot predict with certainty with how that future looks like. But there's a crisis. It's a given. The capitalist system will never resolve that major contradiction, which is the economic crisis that keeps happening. It's always a question: how does it find the masses? How does it find us in terms of organizing a leadership, a vanguard, an alternative that can provide indeed a future beyond the crisis? So yes, Burkina Faso and the entire Sahel are quite an inspiration event that has taken place, and those sentiments are spreading across the continent and even globally.
No, thank you for that. I just wanted to, again, I keep using this term pause, because again, it is a pause, because we're constantly thinking, we're constantly working. I'm moving into next week we are organizing a workers summit that is going to be leading into more projects specifically around workers power. As someone who's working directly with Southern workers, and of course the United States, in the southern parts of the United States, of course this is plantation, generating of a global economy for a long time, and there's some things happening that we are in. So this notion of a working class, you mentioned this, this notion a refusal is a win for the working class. I think that's a very powerful, statement. And this is what Comrade Wawringa is talking about as well. How do we understand and capture the spontaneity of the movements that are happening on the ground at the same time envisioning a new society? So with that being said, I wanted to provide an opportunity, an open space for Comrade Wawringa to, any closing thoughts or any pausing thoughts, I should say, that you would like to share. And also, Comrade Mwangi, if you have any closing thoughts as well. Sorry about that. I actually hiccup and swallowed at the same time. Anyway, so any closing thoughts that will be, obviously wonderful, or we can, pause, and I'll start with Comrade Wawringa, if you have a closing thoughts. Pausing thoughts, I should say.
I think Fanon sparked the consciousness of the revolutionary violence, and he also sparked the consciousness of the role that can be played by the lumpen proletariat. I think it is the duty of the young people, the same way Alenda says that to be young and to not be a revolutionary is a biological contradiction. So it is the duty of the young people, and I think even Lenin expounds much on the role of the youth. And it is the duty of the young people, the duty of the conscious, to tap into this revolutionary potential of the lumpen proletariat in our 21st century and in our societies, so that the building of socialism becomes a reality in our lifetime. I think those are my most motivating closing remarks.
Thank you for that.
Indeed, the struggles we see around the world today, be it in the Sahel, be it in every other part of the world for self-determination and dignity, just remind us that imperialism and the capitalist system is not invisible. And so the question is, what will we do with this reminder that it is not invisible? And I think it's a question that of our organizing to continue and continue rapidly, and most importantly, everybody to join a movement, to join an organization, to belong to an organization or a movement fighting for social justice. And most importantly and lastly, Fanon, again after many years, remind us that that rupture is necessary, but insufficient unless organized, and that Pan-Africanism for us must always be rooted within the masses. And so it is important that we continue to be aware of those who misrepresent Pan-Africanism. It's not just it's not an ideology just to celebrate culture and fabrics in terms of clothes, but it's a very political, ideological institution that we must continue to build, but also to recognize that the psychological war in terms of narratives and hegemony continues, and culture and ideas also remain a key battlefield for us, especially for the young people. So it is important to engage with the works of Fanon alongside his peers like Cabral and others, to continue to understand the kind of world we are in, and to find some of the answers on how to go about it. It's not the complete blueprint, but it's always the greatest guide that they have lived. Thank you.
Thank you both for taking the time to have this conversation. This opening conversation, this invitation for those who listen to this to think about some of the things and some of the perspectives that you have shared, but also your comrades who have shared in this particular series, as we think about other particular ways to bring our work closer together to defeat this global beast of capital itself. So thank you again. Thank you both for your time.